So data catalogs, as you all know, are essential for data governance to be able to find and share all of your data in one place. You can collaborate. Catalogs are essential for governance. And they're also powerful solutions to have that shared understanding of trusted data, or a single source of truth, or a hub for collaboration, or maybe a marketplace to request data. But we know that data catalogs also have some limitations depending on which solution you are using. You might see some of these limitations in the catalog that you're using. Important to note here that not all catalogs have all of these challenges, but BigID has unique solution because we can address some of these challenges in whatever catalog you're using. So first, we've heard that catalogs have they're limited by data source or types. So the breadth of the data that you're covering might be limited by the catalog solution that you choose. And so ideally, you'd like to have a solution that will include all sorts of data types, structured, unstructured data from all of your data sources. So there are catalogs that are great resources that will provide great benefit and value, but they might only be cataloging a limited number of sources. So to get the true value of your environment, you really want something that's going to cover everything. And then also, we know that catalogs often require some manual tagging or definition to add context. So we know this is really dependent. There's a lot of it is automated, but some catalogs, more than others, require a lot of manual tagging. And really all catalogs require some manual work from data stewards to add definition, to add context. Third point is that we know that other data catalogs might require manual connections to maintain a current environment. So we've heard from customers who are using other catalogs who it takes a lot of work on the side of a data steward just to keep those data catalogs maintained and updated and connected if it comes from many different sources. So they require a lot of manual maintenance and manual work. Another challenge is that they are limited the capability to identify data beyond the column names. So there are some great solutions out there that will help you if you have a column name, and it will help you to identify what a friendly name is by the column name. But we also know that it's really looking at the column name and not maybe the underlying data beneath. But they are great resources, but limited just by they're only identifying data by those column name level. So it's at the metadata level. Also, we are hearing about other catalogs. They are limited capability to discover and classify sensitive data. So we have catalogs that are great, made for collaboration and discovery and finding your data within the environment, but they don't have that automated capability to discover and classify the sensitive data. So how do you know what data you need to protect or what data you need to be careful of or how to use it? It's a challenge for some catalogs. We also know that in catalogs, we're trying to enable your data workers. And so we want to build data culture, but some catalogs, data workers who are using the catalogs, they're able to find the data, they can use the data, but they might not know if data is restricted by policies or regulations, or if data is safe to use, or how to share it. We talk about everything moving to cloud, and how do you know what data is safe to share? And in your catalog environment, how do you know what data is safe to share? So I'm going to offer you a solution here. So BigID is going to enhance all of your metadata catalogs. So regardless of what catalog you are using, BigID has a solution that's going to help fill some of those gaps. And I believe from my own experience in various marketing roles, and also working with customers in their various roles and across all companies and all industries, that all roles can benefit from data to make data-driven decisions. And knowing where to start looking it's a great start, right? So whatever catalog of choice you're using is a great start for people to go find the data that they need. But that catalog would be even more beneficial if it were to, say, include all of your data and include additional context so that when users are using your catalog, they know what they're looking for. So we look at how BigID can enhance all catalogs. First, we talk about broad data coverage. So BigID is going to offer you more data sources and more types of data. So BigID connects to all of your data, wherever it is, and it includes both structured and unstructured. We see people using cloud, legacy, any data is all in BigID. And that means that you're able to get a full and complete view over your entire data ecosystem, which is a great benefit. And if your data catalog of choice only covers, say, a portion of your data or only structured data, or you can include unstructured, but you've got to go through some series, BigID can help make that easier, right? BigID can help take all of that, your broad catalog, and we can actually, with some of these integrations, we can actually import and make that all visible for you in your catalog of choice. We also talk about metadata enrichment. So BigID is very unique in that our data discovery, and we're able to find data, and then we have, we'll say, 4 lenses. We do our classification, correlation, cluster, and catalog to find that data and then analyze it and get the context around it. And the difference here is, before I was talking about how some catalogs are able to identify columns by their column name. So let's say you have social security numbers, right? And you have a column of social security numbers, but the column title is something that's completely indecipherable, right? It has no clues as to what is actually in that column. BigID is going to be able to identify what that data is, rather than just depending on a column name or something that has been learned before. We are able to actually identify what the data is based on the physical data. And this leads us into also sensitive data identification and tagging, because since we're able to discover what the data is, we can now identify at scale where your sensitive data is. So both what it is and where it is. And this is really important to be able to identify it and tag it and flag it to minimize the risk of your data. So and we want to do this all, of course, in the catalog that you are already using. But we're able to use BigID to identify all that sensitive data at scale and tag it in the catalog that you're already using today. We do policy tagging. So BigID has a really nice feature of policies, and these could be policies like your regulations and things that are out of your company's policies, regulations. But also you might have internal policies. So you might have whatever your internal rules are, and because BigID has the flexibility to offer both out of the box identification for your big regulations like your CCPA and GDPR. But you can also set your own policies based on what's important to you and have those take action also. Also, let's say taking action. So BigID is based on, it's a catalog. We can take action on the found results with integrated apps. What this means is that BigID has apps, for example, remediation or data quality or retention apps that allow you to take action on your data. So if you're using a catalog, you want to make sure that you have the most current and the best information in your catalog. What BigID is going to allow you to do is to say, let's take our retention app. You're able to track the life cycle of your data to make sure that you are cleaning up data at the end of the life cycle so that you are having a nice, clean environment in your catalog for your users to find data they need and know it's the best data for them to use. It's not outdated, not expired. You're also reducing risk here. So, and that's just one example of an app. We have other apps like data quality. And there's actually a whole marketplace that we just launched about apps, and you should check that out as well. But that requires a whole other webinar for that discussion. Also, finally, we are going to enhance metadata catalogs with a total cost of ownership. So what this means is we talked about a lot of those manual processes. So BigID is able to limit those manual processes. We're able to use our AI and ML for scalability and automation. So the idea is how do we make the life of a data steward so much easier and add a lot of our ML and AI information to make that easier for your stewards, keep your catalog up to date, add more context, and also that keeping it up to date. That's really important, because instead of relying on a steward to go in and have to add context or see what's new, we're able to do that all automatically with BigID. So it's just going to speed up the process so much faster and add context to your data catalog. So we mentioned BigID. This is what we talk about for our architecture slide. So this is what BigID does at a glance. So here at our base layer, we connect all of our data. As I mentioned, BigID is going to connect to all of your data. So structured, unstructured, cloud, anywhere, anything, we can connect to it. And this is also really important when you think about how to identify your sensitive data, because for now, for the first time, we're able to go in and look at files and emails and things that maybe your traditional catalogs can't cover. We're able to add that context to your catalog. Second, know your data. Use those kind of 4 C's layer that we talked about. Everything that we do at BigID is based on discovery. And so we're able to find all your data, and then we analyze it through this classification and correlation and cluster analysis so that we get a deeper view of your data, find out what it is, and then add that context to it. And then finally, action your data. These are the apps that I mentioned, where we can do different things based on your requirements. These are all customizable, and we have a full marketplace so that you can now, for the first time, find what you need and then take action on that data. We go a little bit deeper into just 3 of those areas that I mentioned. First of all, the broad data source coverage. Super important, and this is a big differentiator in how we can help enhance your catalog, because we're going to remove the silos and discover all data, you're saying a single view, but really it's about having a single point to have all your data, to have trusted data across your whole organization. So we know some traditional catalogs are limited, by maybe structured or semi-structured data, and as I mentioned, BigID can find everything. And we're going to connect to all types of data everywhere. It's an open, open platform. We have very specific connectors, like we're going to talk about today, and we have other open. We can connect to all your data everywhere. And then we're going to analyze all data for a complete view of your environment. Next, we talked about the discovery for deeper insight at scale. So this is where I mentioned that we can take whatever catalog you are using, Alation or EDC or Collibra or any catalog that you are using, and we can help add context to that catalog. So as I mentioned, we're analyzing the physical data. So BigID is going to look not just at the column names, but in my example, we're going to use whatever the actual data is. And this is a differentiator for BigID because, as I said, if you have, say, social security numbers or ID numbers or birthdays or whatever the number is, but if it doesn't have any distinguishing title in the column, a regular catalog maybe can't find it, but BigID can, and it can add that context to help add that context to your catalog. And also it's going to eliminate some of that, the risk, because now you're able to really truly find all of your sensitive data. And finally, adding more metadata for context. So sometimes, we have other metadata catalogs that you already might be using that have some of this metadata, right? But BigID is able to offer more. So we have technical metadata, so talking about what the data is, describing, what the object is. Is it a table or a file? Where it comes from? How it's structured? We can also talk about the operational data, so like how the data is being used, what the data lifecycle is, and we can talk about business metadata, so the business purpose of whatever that data object is, like why it was collected and how to use it, and consent or agreements or whatever you want to talk about from a business context. So this is a way that we can enhance your metadata catalogs, whatever you're already using. BigID can add more context so that when your users are using your catalogs, they can now have more understanding and make better choices about what data to use. And reducing risk. So because BigID is able to add this metadata and add more information, we're going to minimize risk to your regular data catalog in 4 ways. First of all, we're able to identify that sensitive data at scale. It's really important because instead of having to go through any kind of manual process, we can do it at scale. So your whole environment, it's all about automated scanning and discovery and then putting that into your catalog. Second, we're going to enhance data context with machine learning. So this is where, as I mentioned, with the more metadata, we can add in more context and more discovery and more information about the data so that people can make better choices. And the reason that it minimizes risk is because you don't want people to misuse data, right? Misunderstand what the data is. So we're minimizing the risk of misunderstanding. So third, we're going to add the relevant policy notifications for regulations and compliance. You probably have very well-meaning people that might not know that mixing some data might be subject to CCPA or GDPR. So adding those relevant policy notifications is going to minimize your risk. And finally, minimize risk by taking action on your raw data. So anything that is old that you don't need, we can find duplicate data with our 4 Cs. And so we're able to now do that cluster analysis, find your duplicate data, and you can take action on it. So your data catalog is just a better data environment for all of your users. All right, let's get specific. So our next section is going to be, we're going to cover all of these specific catalogs, and I'm going to break this into 3 sections. So we're going to talk a bit about each one, and then I'm going to pass to Sachin to do a demo of each one so you can see it in action and see how it works. And what you'll see here as we talk about each of these is that different catalogs have different challenges. And so you might be finding a different challenge that we should talk about also. And please, like I said, put it in the chat. Let us know what you're seeing. Let us know how we can help. What we're seeing with Informatica is that Informatica has a lot of false positives. So what happens with Informatica is we've seen the case where Informatica will, say, suggest many different domains. And then how does a data steward know which domain is the right domain? Well, we can use BigID to add context to help resolve those false positives. What that means is that now a data steward can go in and they can say, okay, EDC suggests that the domain is one of these 12 options, but BigID can say with 95% certainty that it is a name or a boarding pass or a whatever. And then you can go in and it'll help make that data steward's life so much easier and just faster if they have that forward knowledge instead of having to go analyze what it is to choose the right domain. BigID is going to offer the right domain with a % confidence level that then a steward can use and just select this is the correct domain. And again, it's going to help your users in Informatica know what this data really is about. So also along the same lines, validating findings and adding that data context, automatically connecting logical business glossary terms to physical data. This is a big one, right? We know that Informatica users tend to really like their data, their glossary, like the business glossary in EDC. I've heard customers say, this is our source. Like we want this to live in, we're going to keep our Informatica solution. We're keeping our glossary. This is what everything lives in Informatica. And we're like, that's great. We can help make that better, right? So we can take those glossary terms, we can ingest them into BigID, we can match them to the physical data, and then we can put that back into EDC to make that connection. So it is possible, between EDC and Axon, you can go in and you can manually make those connections. But again, it takes a lot more time. It takes a lot of time and effort from a data steward to make those manual connections. So we're able to scale data stewardship by making that easier, by making those findings so that a steward can, instead of spending time on manual processes, just use the BigID findings and it should be a much easier connection instead of having to click through and make those manual connections. And so again, we're going to expect work to validation instead of manual creation, and then surface the data privacy and policy awareness in EDC, which is, again, kind of a big deal, being able to find what data is sensitive, which data is affected by privacy and policies. And now I'd like to pass it over back to Sachin to show you an actual demo of how this works.
Thank you, Lauren. So what I'll do is I'll first just very quickly talk about what we're going to see in terms of the overall flow. So from the perspective of looking at the actual use case as such, so there are specific elements that I want to make sure that we understand. First of all, the process itself is starting where BigID is scanning all of your data sources. It's discovering all the data that you are interested in finding, whether it's sensitive or non-sensitive, it depends on your context. It will basically categorize that, it will classify that. So at that point, we have all the metadata available, something that we can now enrich in other catalogs. So in the context of EDC, we're going to also look at two sub-use cases in that respect. The first use case is where both BigID and EDC have got the same set of catalog available, as in they've both looked at the same asset, but they may have essentially got differing opinions of what it essentially means from that perspective. So in that context, we will add or we will enrich EDC with additional metadata based on what we have classified on that particular asset. And we'll show you that in the product. The second use case would be where EDC does not have that asset or hasn't seen that data from before. In that particular scenario, when we would push the metadata, we will create the whole hierarchical structure in the data catalog of EDC. So not only would you essentially see all the technical metadata, you will also see all of the business metadata mappings that would be result of our classification process. And thirdly, as Lauren was mentioning, one of the key things that we essentially want to ensure by this is all of this makes the life of a business steward much easier, or the business users can essentially review all of these classification results in EDC, and they can curate them. They can identify what's the right mapping, what has come from BigID, and what is the level of confidence that they are essentially established on these. So these are all outcomes they can potentially see. And lastly, we can also start to use the same business terms that are being used in EDC, bring it back into BigID product. So we start to say the same language as such. So that's what we will essentially focus on for today. And I'll now move on to essentially showing you that in the product as well. So I'm just going to log into one of the BigID instances here. So one of the things that you will notice when you log in into a BigID instance is this kind of a dashboard, which pretty much gives you a bird's eye view of what we have already established. We've got a number of data sources where we have essentially consolidated the findings. We've identified the right objects where the sensitive data lives from that perspective. We've identified the critical data elements or sensitive data elements in form of attributes. We've essentially mapped it to the data entities from that perspective, and hence we have things to essentially showcase in our catalog. So we've already done that discovery and classification process in this particular example. So we'll start to review the results of that in our metadata registry or a catalog at the BigID end. So I'm going to use one specific example here, and we'll look at additional examples as we move along as well. So this is one object that I'm currently looking at. So this is a user SHK object, for example, on which we have already performed this classification. You'll see the full object name over here, appacdata.user_shk in that respect. If I very quickly show you the column view over here, this is where you'll see that you have all the technical metadata available, as in all the columns. But equally, what you will also see is the classification that we've already established. For example, here, citizen ID is mapped to HKID. Personal mobile numbers are found in this mobile field, for example. Email and classifier emails are basically present in the email field, country field, address information. So these are all classifications that we have established based on the discovery that we have performed. Now, in our world, if there were technical users who wanted to validate some of these things, we potentially also have a way to also show you these mappings as well, if you wanted to. So you can essentially look at these mappings as well. From a preview perspective, for example, if you wanted to preview some of that data, you can potentially look at some of the actual sample data from that underlying object to be able to essentially see that from that underlying asset as well. Now, very quickly, I'll show you the attribute section, because this will be the bedrock of what we would essentially export into the EDC from this perspective. So these are some of the classifications that we have established, and these are mapped to specific columns named. Some of these you'll see have also got classification categories available here as well, and hence you can potentially see the kind of things that this particular ID was essentially classified as PII, the others were classified as personally sensitive, and hence you have both the attribute level classification and more category level classification for us to use in that particular model. So that becomes our input into the first process. Now, what we'll do is we'll essentially look at how we would achieve this. So you will see that there is a specific app that we have essentially here. So we'll basically use this app to essentially execute this action from BigID to EDC. This will essentially then export some of that metadata into the EDC from this perspective. So let's now look at this on the EDC side of things. So this is where we would essentially be able to now look at data within the EDC. So in this particular case, you'll see that we have that particular object over here that we're essentially looking at. On the left-hand nav, you'll see that user SHK object appearing. So this is a common object that we're looking at within both the catalogs. So we'll review that in that respect. Again, you'll see from the breadcrumb that you essentially have the APAC user APAC data over here. On the description field over here, for example, this is where you will start to see some of the mappings that we've essentially enhanced. Hence, the actual attribute classification that I was showing you earlier, where we were showing the citizen ID, personal mobile, and other things. These are all being added on that particular object in this particular scenario, so that you have a good view of the actual classifications that BigID has established in this particular scenario. And hence you can essentially make much better use of this information.